Chapter 11. The Fossil Record. Darwin said in The Origin that his theory predicted a finely graduated organic chain, but he accepted that the fossil record didn't show that. It was the gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. Darwin also reminded his readers that only small differences between parent and offspring could be allowed. Natural selection could not accommodate leaps or jumps, later called hopeful monsters by the geneticist Richard Goldschmidt, 1878 to 1958, who wrote The Material Basis of Evolution. Goldschmidt doubted that the small differences we do see between the generations would ever add up to anything. Darwin insisted that, by his theory, all living species must have been linked to their predecessors by differences not greater than we see between the varieties of the same species at the present day. It was a severe and admirable limit that he imposed on his own theory. Those ancestors, although now generally extinct, he believed, were similarly connected with much more ancient species, and so on backwards, always converging to the common ancestor of each great class. But if that were the case, the number of intermediate and transitional links between all living and extinct species must have been inconceivably great. But assuredly, if this theory be true, such have lived upon this earth. In a letter to Darwin, written the day before The Origin was published, his ally, Thomas H. Huxley, saw a problem. "You have loaded yourself with an unnecessary difficulty in adopting natura non facit saltum. Nature doesn't make jumps," so unreservedly, Huxley wrote. He believed that nature does in fact make small jumps, but he gave no details. On his round-the-world voyage aboard HMS Beagle, Darwin took Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology with him. The book convinced him that the Earth was ancient, which was a requirement for his theory. But the fossil record didn't offer much in the way of support. Admittedly, only a small part of the Earth had been explored, and some species are known from a single fossil. Wholly soft organisms could not be preserved. Not so, as it turned out. And shells and bones on the seafloor soon decayed. Nonetheless, a profusion of finely graded fossils should be down there somewhere. Yet fossil hunters hadn't been able to find them. His theory-saving solution became well known. It was that the geological record was highly imperfect. Most of the intermediates were never preserved at all, he assumed. So more excavations were called for. Maybe they would turn up at least some of the missing intermediate forms. Almost immediately, a 150-million-year-old Archaeopteryx fossil was discovered in Bavaria. That was in 1861, and since then several more specimens have been found. Archaeopteryx with teeth, feathers, and clawed wings seemed to bridge the gap between dinosaurs and birds, giving Darwin's theory an immediate boost, though some modern birds, such as the hoatzin, also have clawed wings. The digging has persisted around the world for 150 years since then, and about 250,000 fossil species have been identified. According to Michael Denton, so vast has been the expansion of paleontological activity over the past 100 years that probably 99.9% of all paleontological work has been carried out since 1860. A spokesman for the American Association for the Advancement of Science said in the 1980s that 100 million fossils have been identified, and that they constitute 100 million facts that prove evolution beyond any doubt whatever. But fossils, of course, do not make the case for Darwinism. Absent finely graded sequences, the fossil remains of organisms do not imply or disclose ancestor-descendant relationships. Yet Harvard's Ernst Mayr, one of the leading Darwinians of the 20th century, wrote in What Evolution Is, "The most convincing evidence for the occurrence of evolution is the discovery of extinct organisms in older geological strata. Eventually, the evidence for the conclusion that the world is not constant but forever changing became so overwhelming that it could no longer be denied." The problem is that Mayer's indisputable but weak claim that the world is forever changing does nothing to establish ancestry and descent. Henry G., a senior editor of Nature, wrote in 1999, "The attribution of ancestry does not come from the fossil. It can only come from us. Fossils are mute. Their silence gives us unlimited license to tell their stories for them, which usually take the form of chains of ancestry and descent. It is effectively impossible to link fossils into chains of cause and effect in any valid way, whether we're talking about the extinction of the dinosaurs or chains of ancestry and descent. Everything we think we know about the causal relations of events in deep time have been invented by us after the fact." We can measure our knowledge of the completeness of collections, not just of fossils, but of any artifact, postage stamps for example, by plotting what are known as collectors' curves. Scientists use them to measure the extent of many different types of collections. When we start collecting anything, each new item or specimen is one we have not seen before. Then, as we keep finding more, we are likely to find that most are already familiar to us. At that point, our collector's curve begins to level off. Increasingly, our response is likely to be, "Oh, we've already seen one of those." Casey Luskin says that when paleontologists see this leveling off, their knowledge of the different types of specimens is relatively complete. That's where we are today. A paper published in Nature in 2000 found that among the higher taxonomic categories, family and above, the past 540 million years of the fossil record provide uniformly good documentation of the life of the past. Michael Foote, a professor of paleontology at the University of Chicago, asked in 1997, "We would like to know whether we have a representative sample of morphological diversity and therefore can rely on patterns documented in the fossil record." He concluded, "Although we still have much to learn about the evolution of form, in many respects, our view of the history of biological diversity is mature." He used the statistical method outlined above. Foote's paper was cited by Stephen Meyer in his book Darwin's Doubt, 2013. "As more and more fossils are discovered," Meyer wrote, "and as they fail to document the great array of intermediate forms, it grows ever more improbable that their absence is an artifact of either incomplete sampling or preservation." The broadest category of animal life is known as a phylum. The difference in morphology between a member of one phylum and another is vast. Think of the distance between chordates, which include vertebrates, arthropods, insects, beetles, spiders, annelids, worms, and mollusks, squids, snails. Yet to this day, paleontologists have failed to find forms that fill up these chasms of morphological space. Meyer wrote, "Foote's statistical analysis of this pattern, documented by an ever-increasing number of paleontological investigations, demonstrates just how improbable it is that there ever existed a myriad of as yet undiscovered intermediate forms of animal life. Forms that could close the morphological distance between the Cambrian phyla one tiny evolutionary step at a time." In The Design of Life, 2008, William A. Dembski and Jonathan Wells approached the same question from the opposite direction. We can count the types of organisms living today and then compare them with the number found in fossilized form. The percentage recovered as fossils gives us a good indication of the completeness of the fossil record. They gave this example. Among 43 living orders of terrestrial vertebrates, the level of classification just below classes and phyla, 42 have been found as fossils. Carnivores are one such order. Thus, 98% of extant terrestrial vertebrates at that level of classification were fossilized. It is therefore a good bet that if there were other orders of terrestrial vertebrates, they too would have been fossilized. James W. Valentine, a paleontologist with the University of California, found that 76.8% of the marine mollusk species currently living along the Southern California and Baja California coast are also found in the fossil record. Nonetheless, some of Darwin's most vocal supporters insist that the fossil record is radically incomplete. In his textbook Evolution, 2005, Douglas J. Futuima of SUNY Stony Brook said, "The fossil record is extremely incomplete for reasons that geologists understand well. Consequently, the transitional stages that we postulate in the origin of many higher taxa have not yet been found. But there is absolutely no truth to the claim made by many creationists that the fossil record does not provide any intermediate forms." Futuima's is one of the leading college textbooks in the field. There are many such intermediates, he said. Animals called therapsids, for example, were intermediate between reptiles and mammals. He said it is the most beautifully documented example of the evolution of a major taxon. One problem is that the morphological sequence of therapsids does not match the temporal sequence. The fossils expected to be the most reptile-like should come earlier, but there are several inconsistencies. Futuima also said the reptile-to-mammal transition is so abundantly documented that it is impossible to tell which therapsid species were the actual ancestors of mammals. But as Dembski and Wells commented, if mammals arose from just one of those lineages, then the others were not ancestral. In that case, why should the similarity of characters be treated as evidence for ancestry? If the same mammal-like features of therapsids keep emerging without being related by common ancestry, then why should mammals be regarded as related to therapsids by common ancestry? As we saw in the previous chapter, a similar problem arises with convergence. Very similar or convergent characters appear in widely separated groups that no one thinks are related by ancestry. An important point is that fossils cannot distinguish between Darwin's claim that nature needs no designer and the alternative argument that it shows strong signs of having been designed. It is not that such a distinction cannot be made, but that fossils cannot make it. If it is reasonable to assume that a living organism needs no designer, then the same assumption equally applies to a fossil of that organism. In Science on Trial, 1983, Futuima brought up another issue related to fossils, one that is often mentioned by Darwinians. Fossils tell us that there is an orderly history to life, he wrote. Different groups originated at different times. It is inconceivable that flowering plants or horses could have existed for hundreds of millions of years without leaving a trace, and then left a rich record thereafter. Brown University biologist and evolution crusader Kenneth Miller has made a similar argument. The appearance of life on Earth has a sequential character, and he cautioned that any theory of intelligent design must take these sequences into account. To put it plainly, if design is the explanation for life, then the designer has chosen to work gradually, assembling a living world over the course of hundreds of millions of years. Miller's and Futuima's claim that life is orderly and sequential can certainly be taken as evidence for evolution, depending on how that word is defined. But it is also acceptable to those who are more skeptical. In a world of human artifacts, such as automobiles, cameras, and computers, design is always sequential. The Ford Mustang was designed 36 years after the Model A, two of the most successful Ford vehicles. Miller and others who are impressed by the temporal sequence of fossils never explain why they think designers are expected to do everything at the same time. It is one more instance of the evolutionist tendency to stray into theology. Their not quite stated position is that God, if he existed, should have been able to do everything at once. But if sequential design happens with human constructions, why should the sequential design of life itself be ruled out? Cambrian explosion. An important discovery of new fossils was made by the American paleontologist Charles Doolittle Walcott in 1909. The fossils were embedded within the Burgess Shale in British Columbia. Dating to the Cambrian period, about 540 million years ago, they documented what became known as the Cambrian explosion. They were extensively described by Harry B. Whittington, 1916 to 2010, a paleontologist at Cambridge University, and by his assistant Simon Conway Morris, now also at Cambridge. Stephen Jay Gould discussed their findings at some length in his book, Wonderful Life, The Burgess Shale and the Nature of History, 1989. Almost all the animal phyla appear abruptly in the fossil record of the Cambrian. The Burgess Shale includes a range of disparity in anatomical design never again equaled and not matched today by all the creatures in all the world's oceans, Gould wrote. The large initial stock of animals was then decimated. Gould worried about that word because it seemed the phyla were in fact reduced by more than a tenth. And since then, the residue has dominated the history of multicellular life. Gould continued, "The story of the last 500 million years has featured restriction followed by proliferation within a few stereotyped designs. Not general expansion of range and increase in complexity, as our favored iconography, the cone of increasing diversity, implies." Gould felt free to criticize our favored iconography, but he could well have gone a step further and added that the iconography was the brainchild of Charles Darwin himself. Almost all the animal phyla appeared without known progenitors in the Cambrian era. The paleontologist James Valentine has estimated that at least 60 phyla appeared at that time and that more remain to be discovered. He also said this, "We consider these estimates to be very conservative. If they are in the correct general order, then the evolutionary events near the Precambrian-Cambrian boundary not only occurred with unexpected rapidity within lineages, but involved so many higher taxa as to form an evolutionary explosion without precedent, both rapid in pace and broad in scope." This near-instant explosion of body plans is the opposite of what Darwin's theory predicts. As he visualized the tree of life, the number of body plans, or phyla, should increase with time. Yet today, the number of phyla is estimated at about 30, perhaps half the number found in the Cambrian. Dembski and Wells wrote in The Design of Life that the more fossils paleontologists have found, the clearer it has become that they form a pattern at odds with Darwin's theory. The pattern is not a gradually branching tree, but a collection of clusters separated by gaps. Perhaps that should not be surprising. It is, after all, the same pattern we see among living organisms today. Any theory that attempts to account for the emergence of major taxonomic groups within the animal kingdom must explain how such a dramatic range of body plans appeared so abruptly. Eldridge and Gould's ideas about punctuated equilibrium also lent some support to these non-Darwinian views. A paleontologist with the American Museum of Natural History, Niles Eldridge, became an expert on trilobites, extinct marine arthropods, and the best known of the Cambrian fossils. Well-preserved trilobites are among the earliest animals found in the Cambrian. They have lens-focusing eyes with a 360-degree field of vision. Not so primitive, as Stephen Meyer wrote. At first it bothered Eldridge that the trilobites were also similar. Then he concluded that the absence of change was itself significant. Stasis is data, as he put it. He was joined by Gould, and they theorized that animal body forms are static for long periods. Intermediate forms come and go so quickly that they leave little or no record. As a theory, punctuated equilibrium was formulated in 1972. Paleontologists had long observed lengthy periods of stasis in the fossil record. That stability is then interrupted by new species that restore a new equilibrium at a different level. It's as though life's history resembles a series of sharp steps instead of the gradual slope that Darwin had anticipated. Gould wrote in The Panda's Thumb, 1980, "The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. All paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Transitions between major groups are characteristically abrupt." Gould accepted that the intermediate forms once existed, though they were difficult to see in the fossil record. So neither he nor Eldridge should be confused with creationists. Still, they pointed to a real problem, which persists to this day. Interviewed at the American Museum of Natural History in the early 1980s, Don Rosen, 1929 to 1986, formerly chairman of the museum's Department of Ichthyology, summarized the dilemma for Darwinists. "Darwin said that evolution happened too slowly for us to see it. Gould and Eldridge said that it happened too quickly for us to see it. Either way, we don't see it." Stephen M. Stanley, a paleontologist who for most of his career taught geology at Johns Hopkins University, agreed with Eldridge and Gould. But he went even further when he said in 1979, "The known fossil record fails to document a single example of phyletic evolution accomplishing a major morphological transition, and hence offers no evidence that the gradualistic model can be valid." Ernst Mayr complimented his junior colleagues when he said that evolutionary stasis had been unexpected by most evolutionary biologists, and that punctuated equilibrium had had a major impact on paleontology and evolutionary biology. Futuyma agreed. "Species delimited in shape persist without appreciable change for millions of years," he said, "and that is not limited to specific characters, but marks all the detectable morphological features. It is organism-wide, in other words." Fossils discovered in China in 1984 showed an even greater variety of Cambrian body plans, from layers of rock that were older than the Burgess Shale. They helped to establish that the Cambrian animals appeared even more explosively than previously realized, said Stephen Meyer. The Chinese fossils showed that the new phyla, new in the sense that they had no predecessors in the fossil record, appeared within a 10 million year period. No plausible ancestors have yet been found in lower strata, whether in British Columbia or in China. What about the claim made by Darwin that forms lacking hard parts could not be expected to fossilize? The fact is that lots of pre-Cambrian soft-bodied organisms have been preserved, but they don't bring us closer to a solution. Others say that the explosive period took only 5 to 6 million years. How sudden is that? Compared with the reported 3 billion year history of life on Earth, the Cambrian explosion is the equivalent of 1 minute in a 24-hour day. It happened in the twinkling of an eye. Dembski and Wells commented, "The origin of new phyla represents evolution's greatest achievement in diversifying the forms of animal life. Yet the origin of new animal phyla is crammed into the first 1 or 2% of the animal fossil record." When the Chinese paleontologist J.Y. Chen discussed some of these findings at the University of Washington in Seattle more than a decade ago, he went out of his way to express doubts about the adequacy of Darwinism in accounting for what we see. The paleontologists in the audience ignored his doubts, and afterwards he asked a visitor why. The visitor told him it was very unpopular to doubt Darwinism in the U.S. He laughed and said, "In China we can criticize Darwin, but not the government. In America, you can criticize the government, but not Darwin." Darwin knew about the Cambrian strata, which were originally discovered in Wales, not far from where he grew up in Shrewsbury. He also realized that unless closely related fossil sequences were found, his theory was in trouble. The difficulty of understanding the absence of vast piles of fossiliferous strata which on my theory were no doubt somewhere accumulated before the Silurian epoch, now called the Middle Cambrian, is very great. I allude to the manner in which numbers of species of the same group suddenly appear in the lowest known fossiliferous rocks. So the problem has been understood for 150 years. Others have recently drawn attention to it. Douglas Irwin's and James Valentine's The Cambrian Explosion, The Construction of Animal Biodiversity, 2013, was published a few months before Stephen Meyer's book. They agree that no one has found the missing fossils or plausibly suggested how the new body plans arose so quickly. Both Irwin and Valentine have questioned the ability of conventional evolutionary theory to explain what the fossils tell us. Irwin at the Smithsonian and another colleague, Eric Davidson of Caltech, have now ruled out standard neo-Darwinian theory vehemently in Davidson's case, Meyer wrote. In spite of this, Irwin, Valentine, and Davidson remain Darwinians in the broader sense. The paleontologist David Raup said in 1979 that although our knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded since Darwin's time, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transitions now than we did then. Some of the classic transitions in the fossil record, such as the evolution of the horse, have had to be discarded or modified as a result of more detailed information. Fossil remains spread across the history of life confirm evolution if that is simply taken to mean change over time. But a more detailed look shows the fossil record to be more of an obstacle than a confirmation of what is entailed by Darwin's theory.